In the winter of 1874, on the frozen plains of Montana Territory, a single act of kindness would decide whether one man lived or died. What happened when a lonely cowboy opened his door to a starving stranger would become a legend passed down through generations. This is not a story from books or movies. This is a true account of how bread, salt, and simple human decency changed everything. When 200 warriors surrounded that small barn, nobody could have predicted what came next. Some say it was luck, others call it fate, but those who were there knew the truth. Sometimes, the smallest gesture carries the greatest power. The wind cut across the Montana plains like a knife made of ice. It was December, and the year was 1874. The snow had been falling for 3 days straight, and it showed no signs of stopping. The world had turned white and silent, except for the howling of that terrible wind. It was the kind of cold that could kill a man if he stayed outside too long. It was the kind of cold that made even the wolves stay in their dens. In the middle of this frozen wilderness stood a small ranch. It was not much to look at. There was a wooden house with 2 rooms, a barn that leaned slightly to one side, and a fence that surrounded a few acres of land. The house had been built 3 years ago by a man named Thomas Cole. He had come west from Ohio, looking for a new life. He had found land, solitude, and more hardship than he had ever imagined. Thomas was 32 years old that winter. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and hands that were rough from years of hard work. His face was weathered from sun and wind, and his eyes were the color of a winter sky. He wore his brown hair long, and his beard had grown thick during the cold months. He looked like what he was, a man who had learned to survive alone in a harsh land. On this particular evening, Thomas sat by his fire, trying to keep warm. The flames danced and crackled, but they could not completely push back the cold that seeped through the walls. He had wrapped himself in a buffalo hide blanket, a gift from a trader who had passed through the previous summer. His dinner sat on a plate beside him. It was simple food, bread that he had baked himself, some dried beef, and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Thomas was thinking about his life and how different it had turned out from what he had planned. Back in Ohio, he had been engaged to a woman named Sarah. She had golden hair and a laugh that sounded like music. They were supposed to get married and build a life together. But Sarah had died of fever just 2 weeks before the wedding. After that, Thomas could not stay in Ohio anymore. Everything there reminded him of her. So he had sold everything he owned, bought a horse, and headed west. The journey had taken him 6 months. He had crossed rivers and mountains. He had survived storms and sickness. He had met good people and bad people along the way. Finally, he had found this piece of land in Montana Territory. It was far from any town, far from any neighbors. That was exactly what Thomas wanted. He wanted to be alone with his grief and his memories. For 3 years, he had lived this solitary life. He raised cattle, though his herd was small. He hunted deer and elk for meat. He traded furs and hides at the nearest settlement, which was a 2-day ride away. He spoke to other humans maybe once a month, sometimes less. The silence had become his companion, and the loneliness had become something he was used to. But, lately, Thomas had begun to feel something changing inside him. The emptiness that had driven him west was starting to fade. He was beginning to wonder if he wanted to spend the rest of his life alone. He was beginning to think that maybe he had punished himself enough for surviving when Sarah had not. These were his thoughts as he sat by the fire that December evening. Outside, the wind continued to howl, and the snow continued to fall. Thomas finished his cold coffee and stood up to add more wood to the fire. That was when he heard it, a sound that did not belong to the wind, a sound that made him freeze in place. It was a knocking at his door. Thomas stood perfectly still, his heart beating faster. Nobody knocked on his door. There was nobody around for miles. The nearest ranch was half a day's ride away, and no one would be traveling in this storm. For a moment, he wondered if he had imagined the sound. But then it came again. 3 slow knocks, weak but deliberate. Thomas moved to the corner where he kept his rifle. He picked it up and checked that it was loaded. In this territory, a man had to be careful. There were outlaws who preyed on isolated ranches. There were desperate men who would kill for food or shelter. Thomas walked slowly toward the door, the rifle held ready in his hands. He reached the door and paused. The knocking had stopped. He could hear nothing but the wind. Thomas took a breath and then lifted the wooden bar that held the door closed. He pulled the door open just a crack and looked outside. What he saw made him forget all about danger and caution. Standing in the snow was a figure that barely looked human. It was a man, but He was so thin and so frozen that he seemed more like a ghost. His skin had turned grayish-blue from the cold. His lips were cracked and bleeding. His clothes were nothing but rags that hung from his skeletal frame. He had no coat, no hat, no gloves. His feet were wrapped in pieces of animal hide that were soaked through with snow. The man's eyes were the only part of him that showed life. They were dark eyes, deep and desperate, looking at Thomas with a mixture of hope and fear. The man tried to speak, but no words came out. His body was shaking so hard that he could barely stand. Thomas recognized immediately that this was a Native American. From his features and the style of his remaining clothing, Thomas guessed he was Lakota or possibly Cheyenne. For a moment, Thomas hesitated. The relations between white settlers and native tribes in this region were complicated and often violent. There had been conflicts and killings on both sides. Many of the ranchers Thomas knew would have closed the door on this man and let him die in the snow. But Thomas was not like those other ranchers. He looked at this freezing, starving human being, and he saw only someone who needed help. He saw only someone who would die without it. Thomas opened the door wide and stepped aside. He gestured for the man to come in. The stranger hesitated, perhaps surprised by the invitation. Then, he stumbled forward into the warmth of the house. He made it 3 steps before his legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the wooden floor. Thomas closed the door quickly against the cold. He set down his rifle and knelt beside the fallen man. Up close, the stranger's condition was even worse than Thomas had first thought. His body was nothing but skin and bones. His fingers and toes showed signs of frostbite. His breathing was shallow and ragged. This man had been without food and proper shelter for a long time. He was very close to death. Thomas had seen men in this condition before, during his journey west. He knew what he needed to do. First, he had to get the stranger warm. Then, he had to get food and water into him. But he had to do it slowly and carefully. A body that close to death could not handle too much too fast. Thomas grabbed a blanket from his bed and wrapped it around the stranger. Then, he went to his fire and moved the chair closer to the flames. He came back and lifted the stranger, carrying him to the chair. The man weighed almost nothing. It was like carrying a child. The stranger sat in the chair, shivering uncontrollably, staring at the fire with those dark, deep eyes. Thomas busied himself with the next steps. He heated water over the fire. He found more blankets and piled them on the stranger. He cut small pieces of bread and put them in a bowl. Then, he added warm water to the bread, making a kind of mush that would be easy to swallow and gentle on a starving stomach. Throughout all of this, neither man spoke. The stranger watched Thomas's every move with a mixture of wariness and wonder. Thomas focused on the tasks at hand, trying not to think too much about what he was doing or why. He was just helping someone in need. That was all. When the bread mush was ready, Thomas brought it to the stranger. He showed him the bowl and then set it in his hands. The stranger looked at the food, then looked at Thomas. There were tears in his dark eyes. He lifted the bowl to his lips and began to eat, slowly at first, then with more urgency as his body remembered what it was like to receive nourishment. Thomas sat down across from him and waited. The fire crackled. The wind howled outside. The stranger finished the small portion of food and looked up, clearly wanting more. Thomas shook his head and held up his hand, showing the man to wait. He knew that eating too much too fast could kill someone in this condition. The stomach needed time to remember how to work. An hour passed. Thomas gave the stranger more bread mush and some warm water. He checked the man's fingers and toes for frostbite damage. A few of the toes looked bad, but Thomas thought they might be saved if they were treated properly. He wrapped them in clean cloth and kept the stranger's feet elevated near the fire. Finally, the stranger spoke. His voice was hoarse and weak, but the words were clear enough. He spoke in his native language first, a flowing string of sounds that Thomas did not understand. Then, seeing that Thomas did not comprehend, the stranger switched to broken English. "You give food," the stranger said. "You give fire. What?" Thomas thought about the question. It was a simple question, but the answer was not so simple. Why had he helped this man? He could have turned him away. He could have let him die. Instead, he had brought him into his home and given him food and warmth. "Because you needed help," Thomas finally said. "Because it was the right thing to do." The stranger studied Thomas's face for a long moment. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him. He nodded slowly and then spoke again. "I am called Running Elk," the stranger said. "My people are Cheyenne. I was hunting when storm came. My horse died. I walked many days. I thought I would die too. Thomas nodded. He had guessed something like this. A hunter caught by a sudden storm, separated from his people, struggling to survive alone in the wilderness. It could have happened to anyone. It could have happened to Thomas himself. How long since you ate? Thomas asked. Running Elk held up his fingers, counting. 8 days. Maybe 9. I found some roots. Some bark. Nothing more. 8 or 9 days without real food. Thomas was amazed that the man was still alive. The human will to survive was a powerful thing. Running Elk must have pushed himself beyond all normal limits to make it this far. You are safe now, Thomas said. You can stay here until you are strong enough to travel. I will give you food and a place to sleep. Running Elk's eyes widened. He seemed unable to believe what he was hearing. You do this for me? For enemy. The word struck Thomas hard. Enemy. Was that what they were supposed to be? The white settlers and the native tribes had been in conflict for years. There had been battles and massacres. There had been treaties made and treaties broken. The government in Washington was pushing the tribes onto smaller and smaller pieces of land. The buffalo that the tribes depended on were being slaughtered by the millions. Thomas knew all of this. But, looking at Running Elk, he could not see an enemy. He could only see a fellow human being who was suffering. You are not my enemy, Thomas said quietly. You are a man who needs help. That is all I see. Running Elk stared at Thomas for a long time. Something changed in his expression. The wariness began to fade. In its place came something that looked like respect, and perhaps even the beginning of trust. The two men talked through the night, taking breaks for Running Elk to rest and to eat small amounts of food. Thomas learned that Running Elk was a respected hunter among his people. He had a wife and 3 children waiting for him at their winter camp. He had been hunting elk to bring meat to his family when the storm struck without warning. His horse had broken its leg in a hidden hole covered by snow, and Running Elk had been forced to kill it to end its suffering. After that, he had walked, heading in what he hoped was the direction of his camp. But the storm had confused everything. The snow had covered all landmarks. Running Elk had become completely lost. He had walked for days, eating whatever he could find, sleeping in whatever shelter he could make. His clothes had become wet from snow and sweat, and then frozen stiff. His body had grown weaker with each passing day. On the 9th day, Running Elk had been ready to give up. He had found a spot under some rocks where he could lie down and wait for death. That was what his people did when they knew their time had come. They found a quiet place and waited with dignity for the spirit to leave the body. But, as Running Elk was preparing to die, he had seen something in the distance. A light. It was Thomas's ranch, the glow from the windows visible even through the falling snow. Running Elk had not planned to go there. He knew that white settlers were dangerous to his people. He knew that he might be shot on sight. But something had made him walk toward that light anyway. Perhaps it was the last spark of his will to survive. Perhaps it was something else, something that his people would call medicine, a spiritual force that guides important events. Whatever it was, it had brought Running Elk to Thomas's door at the exact moment when Thomas was sitting by his fire, thinking about loneliness and wondering if he was ready to reconnect with the world. As dawn began to lighten the sky outside, Running Elk finally fell asleep. Thomas stayed awake, watching over his guest and thinking about everything that had happened. The storm was beginning to weaken. The wind was dying down, and the snow was falling less heavily. By tomorrow, the sun might come out. Thomas knew that Running Elk's people would be looking for him. A respected hunter did not simply vanish without his tribe sending search parties. They would be worried. They would be desperate to find him. And when they did find him, they would learn that he had been saved by a white settler. Thomas wondered what would happen then. Would they be grateful? Would they be suspicious? Would they see Thomas as a friend or as an enemy who had taken one of their own? He pushed these thoughts aside. He had done what he believed was right. Whatever happened next, he would face it with a clear conscience. He had not turned away a suffering man. He had not let prejudice or fear rule his actions. That was something he could be proud of, no matter what the consequences turned out to be. The fire burned low as morning came. Thomas finally allowed himself to sleep, sitting in his chair with his rifle across his lap. Outside, the world was white and quiet. The great storm of December 1874 was ending. But another kind of storm, the storm of consequences that would follow Thomas's choice, was just beginning to gather. Running Elk slept through most of the next day, his body desperately needing rest to recover. Thomas moved quietly around the house, doing his daily chores and keeping the fire going. Every few hours, he woke Running Elk to give him small amounts of food and water. The Cheyenne hunter was already looking better. His color was returning, and his shaking had stopped. By the second day, Running Elk was able to sit up and stay awake for longer periods. He and Thomas continued to talk, sharing more about their lives and their peoples. Thomas told Running Elk about Ohio, about Sarah, about his journey west, and his reasons for coming to this lonely place. Running Elk listened with interest and sympathy. In return, Running Elk told Thomas about the Cheyenne way of life. He spoke of the buffalo hunts that had once been so plentiful and were now becoming rare. He spoke of the sacred ceremonies and the stories passed down from generation to generation. He spoke of his wife, whose name meant morning flower, and his children, 2 boys and a girl who brought joy to his heart. Running Elk also spoke of the troubles his people faced. The white settlers were taking more and more land. The soldiers were pushing the tribes onto reservations where the hunting was poor and the land was not suited to their way of life. Many Cheyenne were angry and wanted to fight. Others believed that fighting would only bring more suffering. "What do you believe?" Thomas asked. Running Elk was quiet for a moment before answering. "I believe that war brings death to both sides. I believe that we must find another way. But I do not know what that way is." Thomas nodded. He did not have an answer either. The conflicts between settlers and tribes seemed impossible to solve. There was too much anger, too much history, too much at stake. But perhaps, he thought, small acts of kindness could make a difference. Perhaps one man helping another, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they spoke, could plant a seed that might grow into something better. On the third day, Running Elk was strong enough to stand and walk around the small house. His appetite had returned, and he was eating solid food without problems. His frostbitten toes were healing, thanks to Thomas's careful treatment. Running Elk examined the small ranch with curious eyes, asking questions about the cattle and the farming methods that white settlers used. Thomas showed him everything, glad for the company and the conversation. It had been so long since he had spent time with another person. He had forgotten how good it felt to share meals and exchange stories. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for 3 years was beginning to lift. But Thomas also knew that this could not last. Running Elk needed to return to his people. His family was waiting for him, probably fearing the worst. Every day that Running Elk stayed here was another day of worry and grief for those who loved him. On the 4th day, Thomas raised this subject. "Your people will be looking for you," he said. "They will be worried." Running Elk nodded. "Yes, Morning Flower will think I have crossed over to the spirit world. She will be mourning. Then, you should go to her. You should let her know you are alive." Running Elk looked at Thomas with an expression of deep gratitude. "You saved my life. You gave me food and shelter when you could have let me die. I will never forget this. My people will never forget this." "I did what anyone should do," Thomas said. "I helped someone who needed help." But Running Elk shook his head. "Not anyone. Your people and my people, we are at war. You took a great risk by helping me. If other white settlers knew, they might turn against you." This was true, and Thomas knew it. The other ranchers in the territory would not approve of what he had done. They would call him a fool, or worse. They would say he was putting them all in danger by showing kindness to the enemy. But Thomas did not care what they thought. He had done the right thing, and nothing could change his mind about that. "How will you find your camp?" Thomas asked, changing the subject. "The storm has changed everything. The landmarks you knew may be buried in snow." Running Elk smiled. "I know these lands. I have hunted here since I was a boy. I will find my way." Thomas went to his storage area and began gathering supplies. He packed dried meat, bread, and coffee into a leather bag. He found a warm coat that he rarely wore and offered it to Running Elk. He gave him a knife and a fire-starting kit. He wanted to make sure that Running Elk had everything he needed for the journey home. Running Elk accepted these gifts with humility and gratitude. He spoke some words in Cheyenne, a blessing of some kind, and then translated for Thomas. "May the Great Spirit watch over you. May your paths always lead to water and grass. May your enemies become your friends." Thomas felt something stir in his heart. These were beautiful words, sincere and meaningful. He wished he had something equally profound to offer in return. "Stay safe," Thomas said simply, "and give my regards to your family." Running Elk clasped Thomas's arm in a gesture of friendship. "You will see me again, Thomas Cole. This is not the end of our story. It is only the beginning." With those words, Running Elk walked out of the house and into the bright winter morning. The sun was shining, and the snow sparkled like a field of diamonds. Thomas watched from his doorway as Running Elk headed north, following some path that only he could see. The Cheyenne hunter walked steadily, his strength restored, his spirit renewed. Thomas watched until Running Elk became a small figure in the distance, and then disappeared over a rise in the land. Then he went back inside and closed the door. The house felt empty now. The silence was louder than before. But somehow, Thomas did not feel as alone as he had felt before the storm. Something had changed. A connection had been made. Thomas did not know what the future would bring, but he felt that his life was about to become much more interesting. He had no idea how right he was. The days after Running Elk's departure passed slowly for Thomas. He went about his usual routine, caring for his cattle, chopping wood, and keeping his house in order. But his thoughts kept returning to the Cheyenne hunter and the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. He wondered if Running Elk had made it safely home to his family. He wondered what Running Elk had told his people about the white rancher who had saved his life. A week passed, then too. The winter remained harsh, with more storms and bitter cold. Thomas stayed close to his ranch, venturing out only when necessary. His supplies were holding up well, thanks to the preparation he had done before the first storm. He had enough food and firewood to last until spring. One morning in early January, Thomas woke to a feeling of unease. Something was different. He could not identify what it was at first. Then, he realized that the air was very still. The usual sounds of the wilderness, the birds calling and the wind sighing through the trees, were absent. There was only silence. Thomas got out of bed and walked to his window. What he saw there made his blood run cold. Standing outside his house, surrounding his barn and his pasture, were at least 200 Native American warriors. They were mounted on horses, wearing war paint, and carrying weapons. Their faces were stern and expressionless. They had appeared out of nowhere, as silent as ghosts, completely encircling Thomas's small ranch. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. His rifle was across the room, leaning against the wall. Even if he could reach it, what good would it do against so many? He was outnumbered 200 to 1. If these warriors wanted him dead, there was nothing he could do to stop them. For a long moment, Thomas stood frozen at the window, his mind racing through possibilities. Was this revenge for something? Had some other settler committed an atrocity against the tribe? Were they here to kill all the white ranchers in the territory, starting with him? And then, Thomas saw something that made him pause. Riding at the front of the war party, separate from the others, was a single figure that he recognized. It was Running Elk. The Cheyenne hunter looked very different from the starving, frozen man who had stumbled through Thomas's door 2 weeks ago. He was dressed in fine clothing, with feathers in his hair and beads around his neck. He sat tall and proud on a beautiful spotted horse. His face was painted with the marks of his tribe. Running Elk raised one hand and made a gesture. Immediately, all of the warriors went still. The horses stopped moving. Every eye turned toward the small house where Thomas was watching from the window. Running Elk dismounted from his horse and walked toward the house. His steps were slow and deliberate. His expression was unreadable. Thomas realized that he was still standing at the window, visible to everyone. He forced himself to move. Thomas walked to the door, his legs feeling weak beneath him. He did not know what was going to happen in the next few minutes. He did not know if he was going to live or die. But he was not going to hide. He was not going to cower. Whatever was about to happen, he would face it standing up. Thomas opened the door and stepped outside into the cold morning air. He stood on his porch, facing Running Elk and the 200 warriors who surrounded his home. The silence was absolute. Not a horse snorted. Not a man moved. Running Elk stopped a few feet from the porch. The two men looked at each other. Thomas waited for whatever was going to happen next. And then, Running Elk did something completely unexpected. He dropped to one knee in the snow and bowed his head. Thomas stared in disbelief. Behind Running Elk, one by one, all 200 warriors did the same. They dismounted from their horses and knelt in the snow, their heads bowed toward Thomas's small house. Thomas did not know what to say. He did not know what to do. He stood on his porch, alone against 200 kneeling warriors, trying to understand what was happening. Running Elk looked up and smiled. "Thomas Cole," he said in a voice loud enough for all to hear. "You saved my life. You gave me food when I was starving. You gave me shelter when I was freezing. You treated me as a brother when you could have treated me as an enemy." Running Elk stood and turned to face his warriors. He spoke to them in Cheyenne, his voice strong and clear. Though Thomas could not understand the words, he could hear the emotion behind them. Running Elk was telling them the story of what had happened. He was telling them about the white rancher who had opened his door on a stormy night. When Running Elk finished speaking, The warriors raised their heads. Thomas saw something in their eyes that he had never expected to see. It was not hostility or suspicion. It was respect. Running Elk turned back to Thomas. My people have come to honor you. You have shown us that not all white men are our enemies. You have shown us that kindness can cross the divide between our peoples. For this, we owe you a great debt. Thomas finally found his voice. You owe me nothing. I did only what was right. What is right is not always what is easy, Running Elk replied. Many of your people would not have done what you did. Many would have let me die. But you chose differently. You chose humanity over hatred. You chose compassion over fear. One of the warriors stepped forward, leading a magnificent horse. The animal was coal black with a white star on its forehead. It was the finest horse Thomas had ever seen. This is our gift to you, Running Elk said. His name is Thunder. He is the fastest and strongest horse in our herd. He is worthy of a man who has shown great courage and great heart. Thomas walked down from his porch, still trying to process everything that was happening. He approached the horse and stroked its neck. Thunder was calm and confident, looking at Thomas with intelligent eyes. I cannot accept such a gift, Thomas said. It is too much. You must accept, Running Elk insisted. To refuse would be to dishonor yourself and us. In Cheyenne culture, when someone saves a life, they become part of that life forever. You and I are connected now. My family is your family. My people are your people. Thomas looked around at the 200 warriors. They were still kneeling in the snow, waiting. He realized that Running Elk was not exaggerating. These people had come all this way to show their gratitude for a simple act of kindness. In their culture, what Thomas had done was not simple at all. It was profound. Then, I accept, Thomas said quietly. And I am honored. A murmur went through the warriors. They rose to their feet, and now their faces showed warmth and approval. Several of them came forward to clasp Thomas's arm in the same gesture of friendship that Running Elk had used when he left. What happened next would change the course of Thomas's life forever. But, standing there on that cold January morning, surrounded by warriors who had come to honor him, Thomas felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt hope. The story was just beginning. The warriors stayed at Thomas's ranch for 3 days. What began as a formal ceremony of gratitude quickly transformed into something more remarkable. It became a meeting of two worlds, a bridge built across years of mistrust and conflict. On that first morning, after the initial shock had passed, Running Elk explained more about why so many warriors had come. In Cheyenne tradition, saving a life was considered one of the most sacred acts a person could perform. When Running Elk returned to his camp and told his people what Thomas had done, the tribal council had made an unprecedented decision. They would send a delegation to honor this white man who had shown such unusual compassion. But what arrived was no small delegation. Word had spread quickly among the nearby bands of Cheyenne and their Lakota allies. Warriors from several different camps had wanted to participate in honoring Thomas. What was meant to be 20 or 30 men had grown to 200. It was a show of respect unlike anything the territory had ever seen. Thomas's small ranch was not equipped to host such a large gathering. His barn could barely hold his own few cattle, and his house had only 2 rooms. But the Cheyenne needed no buildings. They set up their camp on his land with practiced efficiency. Within hours, a small village of teepees had appeared around his pasture. Fires were lit, and the smell of cooking meat filled the air. Thomas watched all of this with a mixture of amazement and concern. He worried about his cattle being frightened by so many strangers. He worried about having enough food to share with his guests. He worried about what would happen when word of this gathering reached the other white settlers in the territory. But the Cheyenne were thoughtful guests. They kept their distance from his cattle and made sure not to disturb his property. They brought their own food and insisted on sharing it with Thomas rather than taking from his supplies. They treated his home with respect, never entering without permission and always being careful not to break or move anything. Running Elk served as the main translator and guide throughout these 3 days. He introduced Thomas to the various chiefs and important warriors who had come. Each meeting followed a formal pattern of greetings, gift exchanges, and shared stories. Thomas found himself accepting more gifts than he could count. Furs, blankets, knives, and beautifully crafted clothing piled up in his small house. In return, Thomas gave what he could. He shared his coffee and sugar, which the Cheyenne found fascinating. He gave away several of his tools that he could replace on his next trip to the trading post. He offered the use of his well, which provided fresh water that was much appreciated by the visitors. But The most important thing Thomas shared was his time and his attention. He sat with the chiefs and listened to their stories. He asked questions about their customs and beliefs. He showed genuine interest in their way of life. This, more than any physical gift, impressed the Cheyenne deeply. They were used to white men who dismissed their culture as primitive and worthless. Thomas treated their traditions with the same respect he would give to any other form of knowledge. On the second night, a great feast was held in Thomas's honor. A fire was built so large that its light could be seen for miles. The warriors gathered in a circle around the flames, with Thomas seated in a place of honor next to the highest-ranking chief. His name was Black Kettle, an older man with silver streaks in his hair and wisdom lines around his eyes. Black Kettle was a famous leader among the Cheyenne, known for his efforts to maintain peace with the white settlers. He had survived the terrible massacre at Sand Creek 10 years earlier, where Colonel Chivington's soldiers had killed hundreds of peaceful Cheyenne, including women and children. Despite that horror, Black Kettle still believed that war was not the answer. He still sought ways to coexist with the white newcomers. Meeting Thomas had given Black Kettle new hope. Here was proof that not all white men were filled with hatred. Here was evidence that peace and understanding were possible. As the feast began, Black Kettle rose to speak. The old chief's words were translated by Running Elk. He told the story of how the white settlers had come to this land. He spoke of the conflicts and the broken promises. He acknowledged the anger that many of his warriors felt and the desire for revenge that burned in their hearts. But then, Black Kettle spoke of a different path. He spoke of Thomas Cole, the rancher who had opened his door to a starving Cheyenne hunter. He spoke of how this one act of kindness had touched the hearts of all who heard about it. He spoke of his dream that one day, white men and Native people might live together in peace. When Black Kettle finished speaking, the warriors were silent. Many of them were young men who had lost family members to white soldiers. They had grown up with hatred in their hearts. But, looking at Thomas, they could not hold on to that hatred completely. This man had done nothing wrong. This man had shown them mercy when he did not have to. Thomas was asked to speak. He stood up slowly, very aware of the 200 pairs of eyes watching him. He had never been much of a public speaker. Back in Ohio, he had avoided church socials and town meetings because he did not like being the center of attention. But this moment required something from him, and he would do his best. He spoke simply and honestly. He told them about his life, about losing Sarah, about coming west to escape his grief. He told them that when Running Elk appeared at his door, he had not seen an enemy. He had seen only a fellow human being who was suffering. Thomas spoke about his hope that things could be different between their peoples. He did not pretend to understand all the politics and history involved. He did not claim to have answers to the great problems they faced. But he believed that if people treated each other with kindness, one person at a time, maybe the world could slowly become a better place. When Thomas finished speaking, the silence stretched for a long moment. Then, Black Kettle stood and walked toward him. The old chief removed a beautiful necklace from around his own neck and placed it over Thomas's head. It was made of bear claws and eagle feathers, symbols of strength and courage. This gesture meant more than any words could express. Black Kettle was declaring Thomas to be a friend and ally of the Cheyenne people. He was granting him a status that very few white men had ever been given. From this moment forward, Thomas would be protected by the tribe. Any harm done to him would be answered by the full force of Cheyenne warriors. The feast continued late into the night. There was singing and dancing around the great fire. The warriors performed ceremonial dances that told stories of hunts and battles. The women sang songs that had been passed down for generations. Thomas sat and watched, feeling like he had stepped into another world. Running Elk stayed by Thomas's side throughout the celebration. The bond between them had grown even stronger. They talked about many things, including the future and what it might hold. Running Elk was worried about his people. The buffalo herds were declining rapidly. Each year, there were fewer of the great beasts that his tribe depended on for food, shelter, and clothing. The white hunters were killing them by the thousands, often taking only the hides and leaving the meat to rot on the plains. Running Elk knew that this could not continue. If the buffalo disappeared, his people would have no way to survive. Thomas listened to these concerns with genuine sympathy. He had seen the stacks of buffalo hides at the trading posts. He knew about the commercial hunters who were slaughtering the herds. It seemed wasteful and wrong to him, but he did not know what could be done about it. The conversation turned to the subject of land. Running Elk explained that the Cheyenne did not think of land the way white people did. They did not believe that any person could own a piece of the earth. The land belonged to everyone, and to no one. It was meant to be shared and cared for, not divided up and fenced off. This was a fundamental difference in worldview that Thomas found fascinating. In the culture he came from, owning land was one of the most important things a person could do. It was a sign of success and security. It gave a man rights and status. But the Cheyenne saw it completely differently. Thomas wondered if there was any way to bridge this gap. Could the white settlers and the native tribes find a way to share the land? Could they learn to respect each other's way of life? Or was conflict inevitable, with one side eventually dominating the other? These were heavy questions, and Thomas did not have answers. But the fact that he was even asking them meant something. Most white settlers did not bother to understand the native perspective. They simply assumed that their way was right, and that the tribes would have to adapt or die. Thomas was different, and the Cheyenne recognized this. On the third and final day of the gathering, the warriors prepared to depart. The teepees were taken down and packed on horses. The fires were carefully extinguished, leaving no trace. The Cheyenne moved with an efficiency that spoke of centuries of practice. Within a few hours, it was as if they had never been there at all. Before leaving, Running Elk came to Thomas one last time. The two men stood together in the spot where they had first met, in front of Thomas's door. The morning sun was bright, and the snow sparkled around them. Running Elk reached into a pouch at his side and pulled out a small object. It was a carved stone, shaped like a bird in flight. The workmanship was exquisite, every feather detailed with care. "This is my personal token," Running Elk said. "It was given to me by my father when I became a man. It has protected me through many dangers. Now I give it to you." Thomas tried to refuse the gift. He knew how important it was to Running Elk. But the Cheyenne hunter insisted. "You have given me my life," Running Elk said. "Without you, I would be dead, and my children would have no father. This small stone is nothing compared to that. Please accept it as a symbol of our friendship." Thomas took the carved stone and held it carefully. He could feel the smoothness of the surface, worn down by years of handling. He understood the significance of what Running Elk was giving him. This was not just a gift. It was a piece of Running Elk's identity, a connection to his ancestors and his traditions. "Thank you," Thomas said simply. "I will treasure it always." Running Elk smiled and clasped Thomas's arm one more time. "Remember what I told you when I left before?" he said. "This is not the end of our story. We will meet again. And when we do, perhaps the world will be a different place." With those words, Running Elk mounted his horse and rode to join the waiting warriors. Black Kettle raised his hand in a gesture of farewell, and Thomas returned it. Then, the entire group turned and began to move north, following trails that only they could see. Thomas stood and watched until the last rider disappeared over the horizon. Then, he looked around at his empty ranch. Everything was exactly as it had been before the Cheyenne came. His cattle were grazing peacefully. His house stood quiet and undisturbed. Only the churned-up snow in his pasture showed that 200 warriors had camped there for 3 days. Thomas went inside and sat down by his fire. The house felt very empty now. For 3 days, he had been surrounded by people, by life and activity and conversation. Now the silence returned, deeper than before. But something had changed fundamentally for Thomas. He was no longer just a lonely rancher hiding from his grief. He had become part of something larger, a connection between two peoples who were supposed to be enemies. He did not know where this would lead, but he felt that his life had been given new purpose. The carved stone bird sat on his mantle, catching the firelight. It was a reminder of Running Elk and of the extraordinary events that had brought them together. It was a symbol of hope in a world that often seemed hopeless. Thomas knew that the peace between himself and the Cheyenne was fragile. Outside forces were at work that neither he nor they could control. The government was determined to confine the tribes to reservations. The settlers were determined to take more and more land. The soldiers were ready to use violence to achieve these goals. But, for now, in this moment, Thomas allowed himself to feel grateful. He had made friends where he expected to find enemies. He had discovered that kindness could cross any divide. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with a new understanding of what was possible. The winter continued, cold and harsh. Thomas went about his daily work, caring for his cattle and maintaining his property. But he was not quite as alone as he had been before. Several times during the remaining winter months, small groups of Cheyenne hunters passed near his ranch. They always stopped to pay their respects, bringing gifts of fresh meat and warm greetings. Thomas learned to recognize the signs of their approach. He would see movement on the horizon, and he would know that friends were coming. He always welcomed them, sharing coffee and stories before they continued on their journeys. Through these visits, Thomas's understanding of Cheyenne culture continued to grow. He learned about their spiritual beliefs, their social structures, and their history. He learned some words of their language, enough to exchange basic greetings. Each interaction deepened his connection to these people who had accepted him as one of their own. But Thomas also began to hear troubling news from the outside world. Travelers passing through the territory brought reports of increased tensions between the tribes and the government. New forts were being built. More soldiers were arriving. There was talk of a major military campaign being planned for the spring. Thomas worried about Running Elk and Black Kettle and all the warriors who had honored him with their visit. He knew that many of them would be caught up in whatever conflict was coming. He wondered if there was anything he could do to help, any way he could use his unusual position to make a difference. Spring came slowly to Montana territory that year. The snow melted gradually, revealing the brown grass beneath. The rivers swelled with meltwater, and the land began to come alive again. Thomas's cattle grew fat on the new growth, and he began to think about increasing his herd. But before he could focus on his ranching operations, something happened that would once again change the course of his life. It was early April when Thomas looked up from his work and saw a cloud of dust on the southern horizon. At first, he thought it might be another group of Cheyenne visitors. But as the dust came closer, he realized that these riders were not Cheyenne. They were white men, and they were coming fast. Thomas walked to his porch and waited, his hand resting casually near his rifle. The riders drew closer, and he could see that there were about 20 of them. They were dressed in the rough clothing of frontier settlers, and most of them carried weapons openly. The leader of the group was a man Thomas recognized. His name was Samuel Harker, and he owned the largest ranch in the territory. Harker was known as a hard man, ruthless in business, and hostile toward any Native Americans. He had been one of the loudest voices calling for the complete removal of all tribes from the region. Harker reined in his horse a few feet from Thomas's porch. His face was red with anger, and his eyes were cold. "Cole," Harker said, his voice dripping with contempt. "We need to talk." Thomas stayed calm, though he could feel the tension in the air. He could see that the other riders were fingering their weapons, ready for trouble. "What can I do for you, Harker?" Harker leaned forward in his saddle. "You can explain why 200 savages were camped on your land for 3 days. You can explain why you've been entertaining Cheyenne hunting parties all winter. You can explain why you've turned traitor against your own kind." Thomas felt his temper rise, but he kept his voice steady. "I helped a man who was starving and freezing to death. That man's people came to thank me. I see nothing wrong with that." "You see nothing wrong with it?" Harker's face twisted with anger. "These savages are our enemies. They kill our people. They steal our cattle. They stand in the way of progress. And you invite them onto your land like honored guests?" The men behind Harker muttered in agreement. Thomas could feel the hostility coming off them like heat from a fire. These were not men who would be convinced by reason or compassion. They had made up their minds about the native tribes long ago. "The Cheyenne I met were peaceful people," Thomas said firmly. "They meant no harm to me or anyone else. They simply wanted to show gratitude for a kindness I showed one of their own." Harker laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Peaceful? You fool. They were scouting your ranch, looking for weaknesses. They were planning their next raid. You've given them information about our defenses, about our numbers. You've betrayed all of us." "That's not true," Thomas said. "I told them nothing about other ranches or settlers. We talked about our lives, our families, our hopes for peace. Nothing more." Harker shook his head in disgust. "You've gone soft, Cole. Living out here alone has rotted your brain. But I'm here to tell you that this stops now. You're going to cut all ties with those savages. You're going to join us in protecting our territory. And if you refuse, you're going to face the consequences." Thomas looked at the 20 armed men surrounding his porch. He understood what Harker was threatening. If he did not fall in line, these men would come back. They would burn his house, kill his cattle, and possibly kill him too. They would call it justice, claim that he was aiding the enemy. But Thomas also knew that he could not abandon his new friends. The Cheyenne had shown him kindness and trust. They had honored him in ways that went far beyond anything the white settlers had ever done. To betray them now would be to betray his own conscience. "I appreciate your concern, Harker," Thomas said carefully. "But I make my own decisions about who I associate with. The Cheyenne have done nothing to harm me, and I will not treat them as enemies." Harker's eyes narrowed. You're making a big mistake, Cole. A very big mistake. Perhaps, Thomas replied. But it's my mistake to make. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. The tension was thick enough to cut. Thomas could see Harker's hand moving toward his pistol, and he prepared himself for whatever was about to happen. But then, one of the other riders spoke up. He was an older man named Jenkins, who owned a small farm on the other side of the territory. Let it go, Harker. Cole hasn't broken any laws. He can associate with whoever he wants. Harker turned on Jenkins with fury. Are you siding with this traitor? Jenkins shrugged. I'm just saying we have no legal right to tell a man who his friends can be. If you want to drive him off his land, you'll have to answer to the law. The mention of the law seemed to give Harker pause. Whatever else he was not stupid. He knew that violence against a fellow settler would bring investigators and questions. It would complicate his own business dealings and reputation. Fine, Harker said finally. Have it your way, Cole. But remember this moment. When those savages turn on you, when they burn your house and scalp you in your sleep, don't expect any help from us. With that, Harker wheeled his horse and rode away. The other riders followed, though a few of them gave Thomas curious looks as they passed. Jenkins was the last to leave. He paused for a moment and tipped his hat to Thomas. Watch your back, Cole. Harker doesn't forgive easily. Then, he too was gone, and Thomas was alone again. Thomas stood on his porch for a long time after the riders left. His heart was racing, and his hands were shaking slightly. He had just made a powerful enemy. Samuel Harker was not a man to be crossed lightly. He had connections and resources that Thomas could not match. If Harker decided to destroy him, there was little Thomas could do to stop it. But, despite the danger, Thomas felt strangely at peace. He had made his choice, and it was the right one. He would not abandon his Cheyenne friends no matter what threats were made. He would not let fear dictate his actions. The days that followed were tense. Thomas kept a careful watch for any sign of trouble. He slept with his rifle beside his bed and took extra precautions when traveling away from his ranch. He knew that Harker might try something, and he wanted to be ready. But, as the weeks passed, nothing happened. Whatever Harker was planning, he was taking his time. Life on the ranch returned to its normal rhythm, with the usual challenges of spring cattle work and property maintenance. Then, one evening in late April, Running Elk appeared at Thomas's door. The Cheyenne hunter looked worried, which immediately put Thomas on alert. Running Elk was not a man who showed concern easily. Whatever had brought him here, it was serious. My friend, Running Elk said as Thomas welcomed him inside. I bring troubling news. The Bluecoats are gathering in large numbers to the south. They are preparing to march against my people. Thomas felt his heart sink. He had heard the rumors of a military campaign, but he had hoped they were exaggerated. Now it seemed that war was truly coming. What will your people do? Thomas asked. Running Elk's face was grim. Some want to fight. They say we must defend our lands and our way of life, even if it means death. Others want to flee north to join our relatives in the Powder River country. And still others, like Black Kettle, want to seek peace with the white chiefs. Thomas knew that seeking peace was a dangerous choice. The government had broken many treaties already. There was no guarantee that they would honor any new agreements. But fighting seemed even more dangerous. The soldiers had more guns, more ammunition, and endless reinforcements. A war against them could only end in disaster. What do you think is best? Thomas asked Running Elk. The hunter was silent for a long moment. I do not know, he admitted finally. I only know that my family must be protected. My wife and children depend on me. Whatever happens, I must make sure they survive. Thomas thought about this. Then, bring them here, he said suddenly. Bring your family to my ranch. I will keep them safe until the danger passes. Running Elk stared at Thomas in disbelief. You would do this? You would take that risk? Thomas nodded. You are my friend. Your family is my family. That is what you told me when we first met. I am only living up to that promise. Running Elk was overcome with emotion. He grasped Thomas's hands and spoke rapidly in Cheyenne, then switched to English. You honor me beyond words. But I cannot ask this of you. If the Bluecoats found them here, they would kill you as well. Let me worry about that, Thomas said. Right now, the important thing is to get them to safety. Go and bring them here. I will prepare a place for them. Running Elk hesitated for only a moment longer. Then, he nodded, his decision made. I will return in 3 days with my family. And, Thomas, I will never forget this. Never. Running Elk slipped out into the night and disappeared. Thomas watched him go, then turned to look at his small house. He was about to become host to a Cheyenne family in the middle of a brewing war. It was madness, absolute madness. But it was also the right thing to do. Thomas began preparing immediately. He cleared out his storage room and made it into a living space. He gathered extra blankets and supplies. He thought about hiding places in case soldiers came searching. He considered every possible scenario and tried to plan for all of them. 3 days later, just as promised, Running Elk returned. He was not alone. With him came his wife, Morning Flower, and their 3 children. The oldest was a boy of about 12 named Swift Hawk. The second was another boy, about 8, called Little Bear. The youngest was a girl of 5 or 6, with bright, curious eyes, named Singing Bird. Thomas welcomed them all into his home. Morning Flower was a beautiful woman with a strong, intelligent face. She looked at Thomas with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. She had heard the stories about this strange white man who had saved her husband, but trusting was not easy for her. She had seen too much cruelty from white people to let down her guard completely. The children were more open. Swift Hawk was solemn and watchful, already taking on the responsibilities of an eldest son. Little Bear was energetic and curious, eager to explore this new place. Singing Bird was shy at first, hiding behind her mother's legs, but she soon warmed up to Thomas and began following him around the ranch like a small shadow. For the next several weeks, Thomas's ranch became a refuge. Running Elk came and went, bringing news of the outside world and checking on his family. The situation was growing more tense every day. The military was on the move, and there had already been skirmishes between soldiers and various bands of Cheyenne and Lakota warriors. Thomas did his best to keep the family safe and comfortable. He taught the boys about ranching, showing them how to care for cattle and horses. Morning Flower helped with cooking and household tasks, though her methods were very different from what Thomas was used to. Singing Bird spent her days playing and exploring, often picking wildflowers that she would present to Thomas with great ceremony. Despite the danger surrounding them, these were happy days. Thomas found himself enjoying the presence of family in his home, even if it was not the family he had once imagined for himself. The laughter of children filled his house for the first time. The companionship of adults eased his loneliness. But Thomas knew that this could not last. The war was coming closer. Soon, he would have to make decisions that could cost him everything. The storm was gathering, and no one could escape what was about to come. The summer of 1875 arrived with heat and dust and growing fear. Thomas's ranch had become a small island of peace in a territory that was sliding toward war. Every day brought new reports of conflicts between the military and the tribes. Every day, the tension grew tighter like a rope being pulled from both ends. Running Elk came and went more frequently now, his face showing the strain of trying to navigate an impossible situation. His people were scattered across the territory, some choosing to fight, others trying to find safety on the reservations, and still others hiding in the wilderness hoping to be forgotten. Running Elk himself was torn between his duty as a warrior and his responsibility as a father and husband. Thomas watched his friends struggle with these impossible choices. He wished he could do more to help, but he knew that his power was limited. He was just one man with a small ranch. He could provide shelter and food and friendship, but he could not stop the forces that were tearing the territory apart. Morning Flower had slowly begun to trust Thomas. She saw how he treated her children with kindness and respect. She saw how he worked alongside Running Elk as an equal, not as a superior. She saw how he risked his own safety to protect her family. These things spoke louder than any words could. One evening, while the children were sleeping and Running Elk was away, Morning Flower sat down across from Thomas by the fire. She looked at him for a long moment without speaking, her dark eyes searching his face. "You are a strange man, Thomas Cole," she said finally. Her English was heavily accented but clear. "Most of your people hate us. They call us savages and animals. They want to take everything from us and push us away like dirt. But you are different. Why?" Thomas thought about the question carefully before answering. He wanted to give her an honest response, not just empty words. "I do not know why other people hate you," he said slowly. "Maybe they are afraid of what they do not understand. Maybe they have been taught lies. Maybe they have suffered losses and want someone to blame. I cannot speak for them." Morning Flower nodded but waited for him to continue. "As for why I am different," Thomas went on, "I think it is because of loss. I lost someone I loved very much, and that changed me. It made me understand that every person has value. It made me see that suffering is suffering, no matter what color your skin is or what language you speak. When your husband came to my door, I did not see an enemy. I saw a man who was in pain, who needed help. That is all. Morning Flower studied his face as he spoke. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her. She nodded slowly and then spoke again. My husband says you are a man of good heart. I believe him now. I want to thank you for what you have done for us. My children are safe because of you. I will never forget this. She reached out and took his hand, a gesture that was deeply meaningful in her culture. Thomas felt a warmth spread through him. He had earned the trust of this proud woman, and that meant more to him than he could express. From that night forward, Morning Flower became a true friend to Thomas. She taught him more about Cheyenne customs and beliefs. She showed him how to prepare traditional foods and medicines. She shared stories about her childhood and her people's history. Through her, Thomas gained a deeper understanding of the world that Running Elk had grown up in. The children also grew closer to Thomas during these summer months. Swift Hawk, the eldest boy, was particularly interested in learning about horses and cattle. He had grown up with horses, but had never seen the way white settlers managed them. Thomas taught him about breaking horses, about breeding for good qualities, about treating injuries and illnesses. Swift Hawk was a quick learner with natural talent, and Thomas found himself imagining a future where the boy might help run the ranch. Little Bear was more interested in the mechanical aspects of Thomas's world. He was fascinated by the tools and implements that Thomas used. He spent hours examining the plow, the wagon, the various machines that made farming possible. Thomas showed him how everything worked, enjoying the boy's endless curiosity and clever questions. Singing Bird remained Thomas's special companion. She followed him everywhere, chattering in a mixture of Cheyenne and English. She helped with small tasks around the ranch, always eager to please. She reminded Thomas of what it might have been like to have a daughter of his own. The thought was both sweet and painful. July came, and with it came the heat of full summer. The grass on the plains turned golden brown. The creeks ran low, and the cattle gathered near the remaining water sources. Thomas worked long hours keeping his herd healthy and safe. The family helped where they could, falling into a routine that felt almost normal. But normal was an illusion. The war was coming closer every day. In mid-July, Running Elk arrived with grave news. A major battle had taken place at the Little Bighorn River, far to the north. A force of soldiers led by a man called Custer had attacked a large gathering of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors. The native forces had won a stunning victory. Custer and all his men had been killed. Thomas listened to this news with a mixture of shock and dread. He knew what this meant. The government would not let such a defeat go unanswered. They would send more soldiers, more guns, more fury. The war would escalate beyond anything seen before. Running Elk shared Thomas's concern. My people are celebrating this victory, he said. They think it means we can win against the Bluecoats. They do not understand what is coming. What is coming? Thomas asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. Revenge, Running Elk said simply. The whites will not rest until they have punished us for this. They will hunt us across every mountain and valley. They will not stop until we are all dead or imprisoned. Thomas felt sick to his stomach. He thought about Morning Flower and the children. He thought about Black Kettle and all the peaceful Cheyenne who wanted nothing to do with war. They would all suffer for this victory that they had not even been part of. What can we do? Thomas asked. Running Elk shook his head. I do not know. But I must find out what is happening. I must know where the soldiers are moving and what they plan to do. I will leave tomorrow and try to gather information. Thomas did not want Running Elk to go. The territory was more dangerous than ever. But he understood the necessity. Running Elk needed to know what threats were coming so he could protect his family. Be careful, Thomas said. Come back safe. Running Elk clasped his arm in the now familiar gesture of friendship. I will return in 2 weeks. Watch over my family. I will, Thomas promised. With my life. Running Elk left the next morning at dawn. Morning Flower watched him go with tears in her eyes, though she did not let them fall. She was a strong woman who had learned not to show weakness. But Thomas could see the fear behind her stoic expression. The days that followed were long and tense. Thomas tried to maintain the normal routine, but everyone felt the absence of Running Elk. The children asked when their father would return. Morning Flower spent hours looking toward the horizon, hoping to see a familiar figure approaching. Thomas kept watch constantly. He rode the boundaries of his property every day, looking for signs of trouble. He kept his rifle loaded and within reach at all times. He made plans for what to do if soldiers arrived, where to hide the family, how to explain their presence if hiding was not possible. 1 week passed, then 10 days. Running Elk did not return. Morning Flower began to lose her composure. She paced the small house, unable to sleep, barely eating. Thomas tried to reassure her, but his own worry made his words sound hollow. On the 12th day, strangers appeared on the horizon. Thomas saw the dust cloud first. His heart began to pound as he watched it grow closer. He could not tell who was coming, whether they were friends or enemies, soldiers or settlers. He quickly gathered Morning Flower and the children and showed them where to hide, a root cellar beneath the barn that he had prepared for this exact situation. Stay quiet, Thomas instructed them. Do not come out until I tell you it is safe. Morning Flower clutched her children close. Her eyes were wide with fear, but her voice was steady. What will you do? I will see who they are and what they want. If there is trouble, I will draw them away from here. Wait until dark, then take the children and run north. Head for the Powder River country. Find your people there. Morning Flower wanted to argue, but she knew there was no time. She took Thomas's hand and pressed it to her cheek. You are a good man, Thomas Cole. The spirits will protect you. Then she descended into the cellar with her children, and Thomas closed the hidden door above them. Thomas walked out of the barn and stood in the open, waiting for the strangers to arrive. His rifle was in his hands, but he kept it pointed at the ground. He did not want to provoke a confrontation if one could be avoided. The dust cloud resolved into a group of riders. There were about 15 of them, and they were not soldiers. They were settlers, and at their head was Samuel Harker. Thomas felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He had known this confrontation was coming eventually. He had hoped he would have more time to prepare. But here it was, and he would have to face it. Harker led his men into Thomas's yard and stopped. He looked around at the ranch with an appraising eye, noting the cattle in the pasture and the well-maintained buildings. Then, his gaze settled on Thomas. Cole, Harker said. We meet again. Harker, Thomas replied evenly. What brings you out this way? Harker dismounted from his horse and walked toward Thomas. The other riders stayed mounted, spreading out slightly to surround Thomas on 3 sides. We have been hearing interesting things about you, Cole. People say you have been harboring savages on your land. People say you have become a traitor to your own race. Thomas kept his expression neutral. People say a lot of things. Most of it is nonsense. Harker smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Then, you will not mind if we take a look around, just to satisfy our curiosity. Thomas felt his heart rate increase. He knew that if Harker found Morning Flower and the children, there would be trouble. Harker would claim he had the right to arrest them, or worse. The situation could turn violent very quickly. My land is my property, Thomas said firmly. You have no right to search it without cause. I have plenty of cause, Harker replied. There are reports of Indian activity in this area. Some ranches have been raided. Cattle have been stolen. A man was killed just last week, not 10 miles from here. As the leading citizen of this territory, I have a responsibility to investigate. Thomas knew that Harker was stretching the truth, if not outright lying. But he also knew that out here, far from any real law enforcement, Harker could do whatever he wanted. The men with him would back up any story he chose to tell. I have seen no Indian activity on my land, Thomas said, and I have certainly not been raided. My cattle are all present and accounted for. Perhaps you should look elsewhere for your culprits. Harker's eyes narrowed. You seem nervous, Cole. What are you hiding? Thomas forced himself to remain calm. He was not a good liar, but his life and the lives of Morning Flower and the children depended on his performance now. I am hiding nothing, Thomas said. I simply do not appreciate being accused of crimes I did not commit. I am a law-abiding citizen, and I demand to be treated with respect. Harker studied him for a long moment. Then, he turned and nodded to his men. Search the property. Thomas raised his rifle slightly. I said no. The atmosphere changed instantly. Harker's men reached for their weapons. Thomas was outnumbered 15-1. If shooting started, he would be dead within seconds. But Thomas did not back down. He had made a promise to protect this family, and he intended to keep it, even if it cost him everything. Harker held up a hand, stopping his men. Are you really willing to die for a bunch of savages, Cole? Thomas looked at Harker with steady eyes. I am willing to stand up for what is right. If that means dying, then so be it. A strange expression crossed Harker's face. It might have been surprise, or perhaps a grudging respect. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, neither willing to look away. Then, something unexpected happened. One of Harker's men spoke up. It was Jenkins, the same man who had intervened during their first confrontation. This is getting out of hand, Harker. Cole says there are no Indians here. I believe him. Let us move on. Harker turned on Jenkins with anger. You believe him? Why? Because he is white? That does not mean he is honest. Because I have known Tom Cole for 3 years, Jenkins replied. He is a decent man. He is not the type to lie about something like this. If he says there are no Indians here, then there are no Indians here. Several other men in the group nodded their agreement. Thomas realized that not all of Harker's followers were as hostile as Harker himself. Some of them were simply worried about their own safety and had joined the search party out of fear rather than hatred. Harker saw his support wavering. His face turned red with frustration, but he was not foolish enough to force a confrontation that his own men might not support. Fine, Harker said through gritted teeth. We will take your word for it, Cole. But remember this. I am watching you. And one day, you will make a mistake. When that happens, I will be there. Harker remounted his horse and gestured for his men to follow. Within minutes, they had ridden off toward the east, leaving Thomas standing alone in his yard. Thomas waited until they were completely out of sight before allowing himself to breathe. His heart was pounding, and his hands were shaking. He had just stared down 15 armed men with nothing but bravado and luck. It was not something he wanted to do again. He went to the barn and opened the cellar door. Morning Flower looked up at him with desperate eyes. They are gone, Thomas said. You are safe. Morning Flower climbed out of the cellar, pulling her children up after her. Singing Bird was crying silently, her small body trembling. Swift Hawk had his arms around Little Bear, both boys trying to be brave. Thomas gathered them all into the house and closed the door. He built up the fire and prepared food, doing everything he could to create a sense of normalcy after the terrifying encounter. That night, after the children were asleep, Morning Flower sat with Thomas by the fire. She had not spoken much since coming out of the cellar, but now she finally broke her silence. You risked your life for us, she said. You stood against your own people to protect us. Why? Thomas did not have to think about his answer this time. Because you are my family now. Running Elk said it when he left his token with me. He said his family was my family. I took that seriously. Morning Flower's eyes filled with tears. She reached out and took Thomas's hand, holding it tightly. My husband chose well when he went to your door that winter night, she said. The spirits guided him to a true friend. They sat together in silence for a long